Hi, everybody in Midleton College. My name is Lucy Michael, and I'm really pleased to be invited here today by Kate, Rarosue, and Muntaha for their project. I'm a researcher in equality, diversity, and integration, and I've been doing that work for 17 years. I'm also a commissioner in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is racial discrimination, not only in terms of employment, housing, education, but particularly policing and racist crime too. So the girls have asked me to tell you a little bit about my work, and I'm happy to do that, and I hope that you'll find it interesting. So the first thing that they asked me was what inspired me to focus on this area of work. Well, I grew up in Ireland in the 1980s, and Ireland in the 1980s was not a place that was particularly diverse or that particularly thought of itself as diverse. So while we had some diversity within the island and historically loads of different ethnic groups living on the island, in recent history and since the founding of the state, Ireland has been very much about being white, settled and Catholic. And so travellers or people of other religions and ethnic groups just don't fit into that picture. So I grew up in the 1980s and went to a primary school, which was a primary school that had a lot of diversity in it compared to the rest of society. So unlike now, where you can think of many different ethnic and religious groups in the country, particularly in the Dublin area, I suppose, this simply wasn't the case in the 1980s. So I saw that it was possible for people to feel belonging in some spaces, but not in others. And when it came to the late 1990s, and Ireland had more immigration, because the pattern up to that had really been emigration, I started to think about myself and my friends and where we felt that we belonged and where we didn't. And that started me really thinking about whether Ireland was tolerant of religion, whether it was accepting of people of different backgrounds, and what racism and discrimination might do to Ireland's integration, to the social glue that holds us together. So when I was 22, I went off to England, and my first piece of work was working with Afro-Caribbean communities, understanding how across generations, grandparents had aspirations for their grandchildren, and how they tried to cushion the blows of racism and discrimination for their grandchildren, and cope with some of the disappointments that they felt as migrants themselves, that racism really got in the way of the hopes that they had for their families. The second piece of work that I did was with Muslim communities in Stoke-on-Trent and Manchester, and it directly followed the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, and was right in the middle of the war on terror, as it was called in the US, and the increasing suspicion around Muslims. After that piece of work, I've moved more generally into the area of racism and hate crime, and I've been doing that ever since. So one of the things that I do is I work with the Irish Network Against Racism, and we record public reports of racial discrimination, violence, crime, but also hate speech, incitement to hatred. We do that through a website called ireport.ie. And so for the last 7 years, I've been publishing reports with INAR on that, alongside a whole variety of other pieces of work that I do. But that's one that you might find interesting to go and have a look at. We just published on Tuesday the 2020 data. We had over 700 reports in 2020 from members of the public about racism they had seen or experienced. And that covered every different kind of event, but also every different kind of place you could imagine experiencing racism, from the home, from shared flatmates, from school, hospitals, nursing homes, the street, playgrounds, the workplace, as well as public sector organizational offices, the welfare office, the employment office, housing office, the immigration office, and from An Garda Síochána and airport police. So we looked at a whole range of different incidents. Amongst those, I think really is quite stark, given the proportion of Muslims amongst minorities in Ireland, is that 17% of the racist crimes reported to us were against Muslims. and 20% of the discrimination in employment or access to goods and services was against Muslims. So they really constitute a group that are targeted, that experience racism and discrimination as an everyday thing. And there's plenty of evidence for that. There is well-documented work on that by James Carr at the University of Limerick, as well as by the Immigrant Council of Ireland, and a number of other researchers who've looked particularly at the experience of young Muslims growing up in Ireland and growing up Irish. So the next question that the girls asked me was, what do you think the main causes of Islamophobia in Ireland are? And I have to say that I don't think that the causes of Islamophobia here are particularly Irish. All racism has a local context. It develops a local shape and flavour because we draw on the ideas around us. Stereotyping can very often be connected to local institutions or local patterns rather than a standard set piece. But racist language and ideas do come globally, and Islamophobia has been very much influenced by the international events and the way that Muslims have been cast as an enemy within Europe for a few decades now. I see extremely stark parallels between my work in the early 2000s in England and what I'm seeing in Ireland today. I think that the young people who are growing up Muslim in Ireland today are dealing with exactly the same kinds of narratives about them and difficulties in fitting in that I saw nearly 20 years ago. And the reason for that is not because of them, but because of the nature of racism in the societies that they live in. And so, you know, amongst my friends, colleagues, and family, there are Muslims, as there are, I'm sure, in many of yours. Our neighbours are Muslim, our schoolmates are Muslim, but in our society, racism is something that is embedded, and racist ideas and language are something that we learn every day. So, you know, I very often talk about, you know, trying to be anti-racist in our actions and in our beliefs, but being very aware that racism is something that comes at us from every direction, every day, all the time. And it can be extraordinarily hard to resist some of those stereotypes. The ones that we see around Muslims in Ireland, as in the UK and Europe and the United States, have been very much influenced by that war on terror discourse, but also more recently by the so-called refugee crisis, which is deeply linked to European politics and the idea of European culture. We saw, for example, there is a writer in the Irish Times who likes to talk about Western culture and European culture, and particularly to talk about immigrants and how they are different to the rest of us. And I think what's so striking is the assertions that are made about what it means to be European, in other words, what it means to be white European, as if women who are white European are one thing, or families that are white European are one thing, or history in Europe is one thing. And none of that is true. We have seen very dramatic social changes over the last number of decades in how many children there are in families, in whether women are educated, in the freedom women have to marry or to not, in our participation in the workplace. We've seen family size change dramatically just in a decade. In Ireland, we've seen very dramatic patterns of migration, emigration, and immigration. So there's no European pattern to any of that. When you look at history within Europe, so much of it draws on world cultures, and much of it on Muslim cultures and the various ethnic cultures that make up Muslim countries around the world. So Europe is deeply embedded in a global context where Islam has always been one of those major religions. And to assert that Europe is one thing misses out on all of the benefits that we have had from our interaction with Muslim populations over the centuries, with history, particularly in science and maths and politics, all of which have drawn on Muslim societies. So when we think about Islamophobia today, it's about taking a particular stereotype of Muslims as backward or uncivilized, or even in terms of family size or gender politics, and pretending that Europe has not had exactly those same issues around family size, gender politics, and so on, and that it hasn't just changed in a decade. So those stereotypes are always moving, and they're always shifting in relation to who we assert we as white Europeans are. The next question that I was asked was, do I feel there's been a rise in the number of hate crimes in Ireland in recent years? Unfortunately, there has. But there's also more people reporting those. So one thing I suppose is that we have seen racism become something that is more spoken about. But we've also seen more emboldened racism, people who are joining hate groups, people who are perpetrating repeat racist harassment against families. And we have institutions which, while in the early 2000s were reasonably well set up to cope with racism, set up along good practice, drawing from good practice in other countries. In 2009, when the recession came, and our Taoiseach told migrants that they should think about going home, the multicultural Ireland that had begun to be constructed institutionally was dismantled effectively overnight. And that took away so many of the supports that people rely on when they're the victims of racist harassment, when they're the victims of racist violence, and when they're the victims of things like discrimination in employment, services, education, healthcare, housing, and so on. Many of those supports disappeared overnight. So not only is there a rise in the number of hate crimes, we've seen in the iReport data at very consistently high levels of racist assault in the last 2 years, but we've also seen this rising context of hate speech. So we've had more incidents of incitement to hatred from extreme hate groups this year than ever before. And that's a worrying trend. What it does show us is the way that the language of those groups very much mirrors what's happening in neo-Nazi groups in Germany and in the United States. So those linkages and the crossovers between our use of social media here in Ireland and and social media usage abroad, and the relationships between those, and that language and those ideas are coming into Ireland and circulating here and becoming embedded and proliferated through hate groups here. And that's worrying. What kind of impact does that have on young Muslims in Ireland? Well, I think in one respect, young Muslims are subject to many of the same kinds of impact that racism has in general, and that is very deep psychological impact of everything from violence and discrimination to what we call microaggressions, or what you might have heard of as casual racism, though I don't think we can really call it casual, can we? But that is the racist jokes, racist comments, insinuations, that can be really psychologically tortuous because people live with it day in, day out. If you have to go to school with somebody who every day calls you something that demeans your very identity, the thing about you cannot change, that is really damaging. That can be more damaging than somebody egging your house or burning your car, believe it or not, because you're forced in it day in, day out. One of the things I keep recommending for supporting victims in Ireland is that An Garda Síochána adopt a strategy to deal with repeat harassment similar to that they do for domestic violence. Because again, that idea that you're living in a house where you're constantly being attacked by unknown perpetrators, or even by known perpetrators, by your neighbours, is extraordinarily damaging. So we see psychological impacts, we see huge financial impact because people move house, have to buy new cars, very often have damaged clothing, lose school books, have to take taxis to work instead of the bus because of transport issues, have to find other ways to get their kids to school if they meet their assailant on the way to and from walking the kids to school, changing jobs. I mean, just so many impacts on people. And then there's the social isolation that people feel, of not feeling that other people are in solidarity with them, not feeling that anybody else out there understands or can help. And it's perfectly understandable that people would feel like that, because there are just too few supports and there's too little solidarity with the victims of racism in Ireland. So what's the impact on young Muslims? Well, one, they're seeing their parents go through that. They're seeing their parents unable to react to repeat harassment at home. They're seeing their mums or their older sisters being called names for wearing hijab, or even just being Muslim women, whether or not they wear hijab. They're seeing their fathers and brothers described in gendered ways, again, around ethnicity and religion. And all of those stereotypes and tropes around Muslims, both in terms of the kind of Orientalist stuff about backward civilizations and the gender politics and misogyny of that, the idea of refugees that we've seen in Europe, which again is very tied up with that idea of sexual violence, and women being cast as submissive because they wear hijab. All of those things are observed by young Muslims when they're growing up in Ireland. And you know, one of the interesting things in the work that's been done, talking to young Muslims in Ireland over a period of time, has been to see that many of them, you know, stop using their own name and they adopt another name that's more Irish. Many of them will stop wearing clothing. Even the girls might stop wearing hijab because they feel that they don't fit in. They don't go to events where they don't feel that they'll fit. They don't introduce their family to people because they're afraid that they won't fit. To deny yourself your own religion, your own culture, your own family in public to fit in is a really damaging thing. It's something that lasts with you for a very long time. And so I would have some very deep concerns about the way that racism in Ireland is affecting young people, and young Muslims, particularly with these kinds of stereotypes, are subject to that. What impact do I think social media has had on Islamophobia in Ireland? I think that social media is extremely damaging, but to be honest, the media, mainstream media, was there already. 50% of the newspapers sold in Ireland are British newspapers. So they're part of that tabloid press, particularly. So you get a couple of pages of Irish news on the front, and then you get the UK newspaper inside. And one thing we've seen very consistently over 20 years is the British tabloid papers are very, very Islamophobic in their coverage. They have been since the 1980s. And particularly since the late 1990s, when the UK census started to measure how many Muslims were in the UK overall. And suddenly overnight they were able to say, oh, there's 1 million Muslims in the UK. In fact, there had been 1 million Muslims the week before that, but they were never counted. Instead, they were counted by ethnic group, you know, so if they were Asian or Middle Eastern. And since then, of course, that was only just a few years before the World Trade Center attacks in New York and the War on Terror. And since then, mainstream media, particularly those tabloids, have been extremely Islamophobic, and they've played on those stereotypes every way they can. And, you know, we've absorbed that through, you know, British television, we've absorbed it through British radio, we've absorbed it through British newspapers in Ireland. And social media, of course, amplifies that. But we would be foolish to think that that was something new and not something that was already pushed by mainstream media and still pushed by mainstream media today. Look at how many times Katie Hopkins was invited onto the Late Late Show, onto Pat Kenny's radio show, onto many other shows on RTE, at the same time as she was saying comments that the United Nations called genocidal. You know, so in Ireland, mainstream media has not been good on dealing with racism, and actually has courted racism and Islamophobic racism for listenership and readership. So I definitely would put the blame back on the mainstream media to start with, and then say, how has social media addressed that? Now, I think I kind of referred to that earlier when I said that social media really has expanded the interaction between us and other countries through hate groups. But in terms of the mainstream, that Islamophobia was already very deeply embedded. And finally, the girls asked, what do I think, are there enough measures implemented in Ireland to protect Muslims from hate crimes? And if not, what measures do I think should be put in place to protect them? There's a few things that need to be put in place. One thing is hate crime legislation, and that is coming in this year. Now, I'm not entirely uncritical of hate crime legislation. It can be very useful. Minorities and migrants very rarely have equal access to justice, and they are entitled to equal access to justice. And hate crime legislation very often comes with training of police, training of prosecutors and training of judiciary to deal with hate crimes, but also supporting victims who are from from other ethnic and minority groups. We did have a lot of good practice in An Garda Síochána very early 2000s on that, and much of that has been lost with huge underinvestment in the diversity unit in An Garda Síochána, and no training of the judiciary or prosecutors on these issues. So hate crime legislation, if it brings those, could be good. It also needs immigration firewalls. In other words, a division between An Garda Síochána and the immigration prosecutions, so that people who are worried about their immigration status don't have to worry when they want to report a crime to An Garda Síochána. The other thing too is that, you know, it's not just crimes, but also that incitement to hatred. And we do have new legislation as well coming in on that. Again, we wait to see what is happening with that. One of my privileges of being part of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is that I do get a chance to look at that legislation when it comes in and make a comment on it along with my fellow commissioners. And we have a wonderful expert staff there who are legally qualified and expert in these areas, who help us to construct that response. And so we will look forward to commenting on all of that legislation. There's also a need for a national action plan against racism. We last had a national action plan against racism in the early 2000s. It finished in 2007 and was not renewed. At the same time as many of the organizations were dismantled in the recession. The government have promised us one. They have set up an anti-racism committee answering to the Department of Justice, which is to draw up a new national action plan against racism. We will have to see what that looks like. I'm quite sure that it will emphasize education across society, and whether the funding comes with that to do the kinds of things we need, like training for teachers and school principals, classroom materials, in the curriculum, a review of discrimination in housing and health, as well as education. All of those things need investment, and we wait to see whether the government sees fit to do that. Look, I hope that that's been useful and interesting for you, and I hope that all your projects go well, and enjoy the rest of today. Thanks a million.